let us discuss the ship of Theseus. Good old Theseus, hero famous for slaying the Minotaur, is sailing around the Aegean Sea, but his ship takes some damage, so he has to replace some of the pieces. Theseus gets into scraps fairly often, so he starts needing to replace more and more parts of the ship, until eventually, every last part of the ship has been replaced. So, the question that philosophers have been debating for millennia is, with all the pieces replaced, is it still the same ship? If it's not the same ship, when did it become a new ship? Was it when the very last piece was replaced, or is there a certain percentage value of old ship to new ship? Like, once we cross 50% integrity, that's it, it's a new ship now. But I have my own modifier on this test that I'd like to submit. Do I get bonus points for killing the Minotaur myself if I replace Theseus along with his stupid boat? How does that factor into this equation? Assassin's Creed Odyssey is the most divisive game in the entire franchise, and I don't mean divisive in the way that Assassin's Creed Shadows is divisive because it has a black samurai in it. I mean actually, literally, divisive. It divides people. It's a game that alienated a lot of traditional Assassin's Creed fans, while at the same time establishing its own fan base that's almost completely separate from the rest of the series. It's just the sort of game that inspires strong opinions in people one direction or the other. It is a game of Theseus. Continuing from the direction of Origins, we have systematically removed every single piece of the Assassin's Creed formula until no original part remains. There are no Assassins or Templars, there's no White Hoods, there's no Hidden Blade, there's no social stealth, there's no grounding in reality, there's not even a set protagonist. And so we get the ultimate question. Is this even Assassin's Creed anymore, or is it something else now? And right here, right now, is where we get to what's probably going to be my spiciest take in this entire series. I hate having this argument. I don't care if it's the same ship or not. I care if it still floats. By extension, I don't care what the game is called. I care if the game is good. I absolutely hate the thought of being so stubborn that I can't accept something great just because it's not great in the ways that I wanted or expected it to be. And make no mistake, Assassin's Creed Odyssey is a great game, you just have to be willing to meet it where it's at. It is unlike any previous game in the series, even Origins for the most part, but I refuse to see that difference as an inherent problem. I'm not saying this is the only reason people dislike the game. There are plenty of reasons to dislike Odyssey even if you've never touched another Assassin's Creed game. But after 10 years of previous games, this franchise baggage absolutely dominates the conversation around Odyssey even to this day. Odyssey is also just an absolutely gargantuan game. Origins was big and Odyssey is twice as big before you even get into the DLC. Because of that size, I don't want to waste time talking about what the game isn't. I want to talk about what the game is and how it lives up to the standards that it sets for itself. So, without further ado, let's talk about Assassin's Creed Odyssey. Assassin's Creed Odyssey is the story of Cassandra the Eagle-Bearer, a mercenary with a dark past and an uncertain future. Or it's the story of Alexios the Eagle-Bearer, depending on the most important choice in the game, because Odyssey is an RPG, not just in the gameplay mechanics like Origins, but in its core foundations. I'm going to stick with Cassandra for reasons that will become apparent later, but just keep in mind for now that this other guy also exists. Odyssey begins in much the same way as Origins did, with a smaller starter location that introduces you to the basics of the format as well as drip-feeding you the backstory of the main character. For Bayek, this was his hometown of Siwa, and for Cassandra, it's the island of Kefalonia. Odyssey truly lives up to its name. It is an Odyssey. In fact, in many ways, it's the Odyssey. It borrows its story structure from Homer's ancient Greek epics, which gives it a substantially different scope from any other game in the series. It's as much a pivot away from Origins as Origins was from the games before. Kefalonia is right next to Ithaca, the homeland that Odysseus spends all his time trying to return to on his long voyage. His ancient palace is even one of the first places you visit in the game. Cassandra is a Greek hero from the same lineage as Theseus or Odysseus. She doesn't know that yet, but it's what she's destined to become, by blood and by the will of the gods. She's the granddaughter of King Leonidas of Sparta and carries his broken spear, as well as her pet eagle Icaros. A gift from Zeus, at least according to what her little friend Phoebe says.
Of course. Help yourself.
You hungry too, Icarus? Do you think Zeus would bless me with an ego like he blessed you, Cassandra? Maybe you could ask him for me.
Phoebe, we've been over this.
I know. He's just an eagle.
Every hero needs their humble beginnings, and that's what Kefalonia provides, a safe place for small-scale problems to contrast the epic adventure to come. It's a deliberately slow start to the game, easing you into the world and the extremely dramatic departures from previous games in the series. Cassandra has spent most of her life working for Marcos, a kooky uncle figure who took her in after he found her stranded on a beach. Marcos owes money to a local crime boss, the Cyclops, and thus makes up the structure of Book 1 of her Odyssey. Cassandra is a very hard character to talk about because of the nature of RPGs. A lot of her beliefs and personality traits are left up to the player to decide. It's up to you how strongly she believes in the gods, whether she's a merciful or vindictive sort of mercenary, whether she tolerates Marcos and his bullshit or not. There are immutable truths to the character though. I promise I'll try my best not to pull this comparison out too often, but she comes from the Witcher school of RPG protagonists. Like Geralt, there are core personality traits and beliefs of the character which the RPG choices operate within. Regardless of your choices, Cassandra is always highly driven and ambitious, quick to deflect with sarcasm, angry when provoked, and tries her best to be a good person even in a morally ambiguous profession. She's a lot like Geralt actually, and this game is a lot like The Witcher 3, but I simply do not have the time or the arse to play through all of The Witcher 3 again for a video that isn't about that game, because it's almost as long as this one. So I really don't want to get too bogged down in a debate about which game does what better. I'm sure there are other videos out there that make that breakdown better than I could, be arsed. Something really interesting about Odyssey's RPG mechanics, especially here on Kefalonia, is that they're designed with the idea that the player is new to the concept of an RPG and how it works. A lot of the quests on Kefalonia are built to introduce a player to how to play an RPG. From basic cause and effect stuff like sparing some bandits leading to them ambushing you just down the road, to a seemingly inconsequential side quest having serious ramifications later on. It's also the developers themselves testing the waters with this stuff. Ubisoft doesn't really make RPGs, at least they didn't before this game, so you're watching the writers play around with a format that they've never actually done before. There's a kind of eagerness you can feel behind it, like a kid playing with a new toy, excited by all the storytelling opportunities an RPG gives them in contrast to how things work in all the other games. It comes with drawbacks too. Cassandra is much more of a player vessel than any of the previous protagonists, although not quite to the same level as something like Mass Effect. She's a deliberately shallower character than someone like Bayek, so that the player can pour more of themselves into her and she's able to make diverting decisions. That's not to say she's a bad character, I like Cassandra a lot, but part of that likability is that RPG magic. I'm as much an author of who Cassandra is as the writers of the game, so of course I like her. Cassandra's humdrum present is contrasted against her very dark past. When she was just a kid back in Sparta, the Oracle of Delphi prophesied that her younger brother had to be sacrificed. And when she tried and failed to rescue him, Spartan law demanded that she be sacrificed too, by her own father no less. She managed to survive and has been avoiding that past ever since. Her story truly begins when a slimy weirdo comes to Kefalonia with a job offer for her. She's to assassinate the Wolf of Sparta, a famous general and hero who also happens to be her dad, Nikolaos. Odyssey isn't really a story of revenge, it's more complicated than that. Hunting the Wolf of Sparta is only book 2 of a much longer Odyssey. It's really just another starting chapter, a personal vendetta against the stubborn traditionalist asshole who threw you off a cliff. Odyssey's story is as long and winding as its namesake. The Odyssey is split into 24 books, with each book covering a separate part of Odysseus' adventure to make it back home and then reclaim his home. Assassin's Creed Odyssey uses the exact same structure. Each region of this shockingly massive map is a chapter in the ongoing story. It's much more like a long-running TV show than a cinematic movie or even the previous more linear Assassin's Creed games. It is a perfect case of gameplay driving the narrative. Origins set you up as the wandering hero of Egypt, venturing from town to town, righting wrongs and helping people. Origins was at its worst when it delved back into that linear action storytelling of the previous games. So Odyssey leans even more into that wandering hero idea and structures the entire game around searches and region by region quest progression. Odyssey and Origins share the same bones. The core game systems are all mostly the same. The stealth is the same, the way you move around the world is the same, the UI is exactly the same. The combat has the most changes, but it's still built around the same core blocks. Odyssey is an exercise in streamlining everything that worked in Origins into something more focused. The driver of the biggest differences is the protagonist. Bayek was a very skilled man, but he was just a man. Cassandra is a Greek hero, a demigod with supernatural abilities. Along with the regular abilities that Origins provided, Cassandra gains more and more magical abilities as the game progresses and her power grows, starting with simple stuff like a kick and ending with the ability to teleport around stabbing people with the speed of Hermes. This does have an in-universe explanation, in fact it has two. The Broken Spear of Leonidas is a piece of Eden, an ancient magical weapon that allows Cassandra to access these supernatural abilities. She's also a descendant of the first civilization, in this game officially called the Isu, and contains within her their DNA, which is what allows her to use the spear the way she does, as well as some other Isu relics which come up later in the story. This is, ultimately, a continuation of what started with the Curse of the Pharaohs DLC in Assassin's Creed Origins, a deliberate bleeding of mythology into reality. Odyssey strives to present ancient Greece as the people of ancient Greece perceived it, where the gods are real, there's monsters hiding under the mountains, and great heroes whom the gods have blessed to fight against those monsters. Whether Cassandra believes she's descended from the gods or not is up to the player to decide, but it's certainly what other people in the world believe about her. And what she functionally is from a narrative perspective. Every bit the mythological figure is someone like Achilles or Heracles. This is really the driving force of the division that Odyssey causes. Can you accept this? Odyssey is no longer aiming for historical authenticity. You can make choices, which definitionally means that the information is unreliable. But more than that, you're not playing through history, you're playing through a fable. Odyssey's setting, around 450 BC, is a transitional period. It's the beginning of what we even consider to be history, primarily because of one of your companions on this adventure, Herodotus, who invented the study of history. Before that point is prehistory, where it becomes hard for us to know what's real and what's myth and legend. The lines between the two are completely blurred because the legends, like the Odyssey, are all we have left. We're not sure if Odysseus was a real guy or just a story people told or some kind of amalgamation of a bunch of different people with some grounding in reality. We're not sure if any of the Greek heroes were real. We probably never will be. I think that makes Odyssey's narrative choices genius. Cassandra is the last Greek hero, the last bastion of myths and legends and magic before the world becomes a more rational, mundane place. In fact, she is the herald of the end of the Age of Legends, eventually, but that's far down the road from where we start. If you're looking at this from a pure realism perspective, then it's a betrayal of what came before, no doubt. But it is true to the way that Herodotus wrote his own history, blending local legend and folklore in with more concrete facts, because he had no way to tell the difference. In his time period, there was no difference. The Assassin's Creed games were always about showing the secret history of the world, so Odyssey takes that aspect of our earliest historical writings and makes it reality. It shows a world where myth and truth are one and the same, and eventually shows us why that's no longer the case. If you can accept this fundamentally different approach to history, then there is no game that does what Odyssey does as well as Odyssey. Once you get over the shock of having superpowers, Cassandra just feels great to play. The power wheel adds something that feels like it was missing from Origins combat, a certain level of dramatic flair. There's a lot of stuff that's been rebalanced to make the combat more aggressive, but also to give you a lot more power. The shield is gone, replaced with your magic spear, but the game adds a perfect dodge slow-mo reward akin to Breath of the Wild, as well as an automatic parry move instead of a block, so that either way you avoid damage, you're always staying on the offensive. There's still that annoying thing in stealth where sometimes you can't assassinate a guy if your stats aren't good enough, but there's also a whole range of stealth superpowers like the aforementioned dash around move to compensate for that. Stealth is actually better incentivized with the bounty system, rather than a traditional notoriety where all the guards get mad at you. When you commit crimes you get a bounty, and once your bounty is high enough, bounty hunters will start coming after you. You're not the only mercenary in Greece, and these guys are always tough opponents, but they're only hostile if you have a bounty, so you can stick to the bushes and avoid them entirely, or you can go in guns blazing to summon them to you for their high-level gear if you really want to. Odyssey keeps the gear system from Origins and adds a bunch more, because now all of your armour is also part of the gear system, although blissfully you can choose what it looks like separate from the statistics. There's also your ship, the Andrestia, which you pick up as you leave Kefalonia, which functions exactly like the Jackdaw or the Morrigan did back in those earlier games. Your transport around the world with its own entire combat system and a whole host of upgrades to invest resources in. The one system that doesn't quite come together is also the system that's introduced to you here in Megaris as you're looking for your dad. The War. The game is set during the Peloponnesian War, a conflict between Athens and Sparta that lasted almost 30 years. The war is sometimes an important aspect of the story, but it's way more often an aspect of mechanical concern. As a mercenary, you can work for either the Athenians or the Spartans, and then join in on these big conquest battles to either secure the region or capture it for whichever side you pick. This applies to every region on the map except for Kefalonia, Athens and Sparta, which obviously stay in control of their respective city-states. And this war is always happening in the background. These regions will switch hands all the time with no interference from you. There is no winning the war and no losing the war, just forever war. Which makes engaging with the system all feel sort of pointless. You get good gear rewards from doing it, but you get good gear rewards from doing basically everything. There's so many other things going on in the game that having one redundant system doesn't really matter. It's more a sign of things to come for the next game. A lot of significance is put on this system that you're actually completely fine to ignore for 85% of the game. It's all introduced to you alongside Cassandra's adopted brother Stentor, although he doesn't know that yet. To get close to the wolf, you have to win the region for Sparta, and once you do, you're presented with another big choice. Are you actually going to kill your father, dramatically throw him off the cliff like he did to you, or are you going to spare him and let him live with the shame and regret? This setup is another tutorial that works on multiple levels. It introduces the war mechanics, but more than that, it primes you for the structure that the rest of the game is going to follow. Odyssey's size and scale can be quite intimidating at first, or boring to others, but the secret to understanding it and enjoying it is to understand this epic structure. Odyssey uses episodic storytelling exactly like a long-running TV show does. Each episode, Cassandra will arrive at a new place, meet some new people, do some stuff with them and for them, and then more often than not end on some big decision. Structurally, most of these episodes are the same, but thematically and tonally they can be wildly different. Megaris is all about the family drama, but next up is Delphi, which is much more about political intrigue and introducing the real villains of the game. There's even more to this TV show structure, because not only is there episodes, there's seasons, at least 3 in the base game, with more added by the DLC. Episodes that are connected as part of a larger trend in the narrative. Season 1 is set up right here by your dad. He reveals that not only is he not your real dad, but your mother, Marini, is still alive somewhere. And so, Season 1 is about retracing her steps after Sparta to find her and reunite with her. Viewed as a 100-hour non-stop adventure, Odyssey is exhausting, but split into these 2 to 3 hour chunks, it becomes a lot easier to appreciate what Odyssey is doing, and the sense of familiarity this extreme long-form storytelling can create. It would take a TV show 7 years and $7 billion to get to the same runtime and amount of storytelling that Odyssey does, and it wouldn't be half as pretty. I won't say Odyssey is an improvement over Origins in the visuals department, but it's more of the same, and it's still absolutely gorgeous. That sense of discovery and wonder is still alive and well in Odyssey, that feeling of anticipation for what's over the next vista or what you'll find on the next island. At this time, Greece wasn't so much a country as it was a whole bunch of city-states with a broadly shared culture and language, and Odyssey thrives in that environment. Just like Egypt, Greece is a very old country and the ruins of the older Minoan and Mycenaean civilizations are everywhere. In line with the rest of the game, there's a fantastical element to some of it, with these massive, obviously ahistorical statues. But they somehow feel like they belong, like these ancient wonders that have been lost to time as the world becomes a less magical place. The episodic structure is also directly tied into the game world because the theme of each episode is also a big driver of the things you find in the region. Argolis, for example, is where you first went into Hippocrates, so most of the side quests there revolve around healing and medicine. Both the old way of praying to the gods for help and the revolutionary new way that Hippocrates was pioneering where you actually help people. But for me, the true magic of Odyssey's open world is in the sync points. They've been a staple of the series since the first game, and apparently some people are sick of them, but Odyssey takes them to the next level, and it's all in the music. Because instead of having a set synchronization music cue, there are a bunch of different little things that are tied to the location. So synchronization is not only giving you the lay of the land, it's setting the tone of the whole episode to come. The theme in Sparta is angry and militaristic, but with a strange comforting edge because this is still Cassandra's home. The Athens theme is calmer, but also full of life, representing the city of democracy and philosophy. The themes on the islands are peaceful and serene, representing an escape from all the drama on the mainland. talk about music much, which if you are a big Assassin's Creed fan watching through the series must be very annoying, because the franchise generally has some of the best music in the business. I don't talk about it much because there's only so many ways I know how to say the music is very good. Besides, praising Ezio's family feels completely redundant at this point. Odyssey, though, I will talk about because it's my favourite soundtrack in the whole series. Along with the game it's a part of, it's one of the biggest, and so much of it is just about setting tone and atmosphere for the open world. Like all these different sync point music cues, or how almost every important NPC in the game gets their own music cue to set the mood for their conversations, like Marcos' silly little jingle, or Socrates' contemplative melody. A long-running TV show is nothing without its supporting cast, and along with Cassandra there are two others on this adventure throughout. Herodotus, the wise storyteller and historian, and Barnabas, the trusty old sea captain with a love of the gods and a fairy tale from every island. Between the two of them is the balance that the game rests on. Herodotus, a man of history, and Barnabas, a man of mythology, with Cassandra in the middle, existing in both worlds. Before you can fully begin your hunt for Marini, you still need to settle things with the weird dude who paid you to kill your dad. And while you're in Delphi, Barnabas suggests you pay a visit to the Oracle, because a bit of prophecy never hurt anyone, right? This is where you first pick up Herodotus, but it's also where an entire secondary aspect of the story and the game world opens up, because who could have guessed this? The Oracle doesn't actually hear the words of Apollo, she hears the words of a secret organisation trying to control the Greek world, the Cult of Cosmos. A sinister secret society in my Assassin's Creed, who could have predicted this? There's a lot to say about the Cult of Cosmos, their plans, and particularly the other big revelation of this scene, but we'll save that for now. Cassandra's next stop and the next episode is Athens, and this is where historical authenticity really comes swinging back into sharp focus. Because the game's portrayal of the Athenian political situation and all of the major figures of the era is excellent. From the sexed up schemes of Alcibiades, the drama between the various playwrights, poets and philosophers at Pericles' Symposium, and my absolute favourite, best boy, Socrates.
Is a Spartan general who brings order to his troops, thereby saving his own life, self-serving? I'm not sure that's the case.
Ruling a city and fighting in battle are different things.
By practicing the art of war, doesn't the general guarantee some of his troops a ferry ride to Hades, when a swift retreat would save all their lives?
You just said a general isn't self-serving when he brings order to his troops. Then you said he is self-serving because retreating would save the lives of his men? What are you trying to say?
I never tried to say anything.
But you just said those things.
I said the words, but I didn't say anything at all. I only attempted to gain your view on the matter.
He is incredibly annoying to talk to, which makes him both the perfect portrayal of Socrates and an absolutely perfect NPC to put into an RPG. All of his side quests are about setting up a moral quandary to see how you react, like finding a stolen horse, but the thief needs it much more than the actual rich stable owner. Is it more moral to return the horse or let the thief keep it? Socrates won't judge you regardless of what you pick, but he will very convincingly argue the opposite of whatever you choose, and in that way force you to think about why you make the decisions you make, and question your own moral compass. It's a prime example of how the RPG mechanics enhance the story being told. There's a big difference between watching a character spar with Socrates and actually sparring with Socrates yourself. After the Symposium is also where the narrative branches off for the first time. You go there looking for leads and you find 3, each leading you to different regions with their own themes and episodes. Marini was spotted on Chaos, an island of pirates. She once went to Argolis and met with Hippocrates. And for a time she was in Corinthia where she befriended the local prostitutes. 3 episodes with distinct characters, themes and tones. Chaos is a light-hearted pirate adventure with a fearsome pirate queen and her idiot brother. Argolis is a very serious quandary on the value of life and death. The magic of the episodic structure is that both can exist in tandem and in fact enhance each other with their vastly different tones. Argolis actually contains both the best and the worst of the RPG choices in the game. For one of the best, there's a point where Hippocrates asks you to fetch another doctor to help him save a patient, but when you get there the other doctor already has a patient, and if he leaves the patient dies. There is no correct answer here, you just have to make a call for whatever reasons you decide. For worst, there's the moment where you catch up to the cultist who stole your baby brother after Marini brought him to Argolis to try and save him after he fell off that cliff, and she presents you with the choice of chase after her and kill her or save a baby from a burning building, which might be the literal opposite of a complex moral decision. In fact, the first time I played, I didn't even realise it was a decision because I went straight for the baby without a second thought, like any sane human being would. Not every choice in an RPG is going to be a winner. Season 1 ends with what's probably the darkest episode in the game, where Odyssey crosses over with a very important historical event of the era, the Athens Plague, which wiped out about a third of the city's population. Having done a bunch of light-hearted stuff the last time you were in Athens is what makes this chapter work so well. Beyond wars and assassinations, plague is truly history's biggest killer. And with the sight of bodies piled and burning out in the streets while the living dead shamble aimlessly around, there is an overwhelming atmosphere of misery. Makes you real thankful for this dude, even if right now there's not much he can do about it. The cult uses the chaos caused by the plague to seize power, replacing the peaceful Pericles with the violent demagogue Cleon. You're forced to run away with Pericles' widow Aspasia, but not before the game delivers one last gut punch when the cult also kill Phoebe the orphan, who independently made her way to Athens and has been trying to help you throughout the season. Because I guess this modern era of Assassin's Creed is the era of child murder? It's a dark, dramatic season finale, but it ends with a glimmer of hope. The cult is now at the height of their power, but you know where your mother is now, and once you've been reunited, you can start making your counterattack. But before we get to that, we need to talk about Spartan Triremes. In his own review of the game, Blue, from Overly Sarcastic Productions, used Spartan Triremes as a placeholder for any time the game sacrifices historical accuracy for the sake of gameplay, and it really is a perfect example, so I'm going to steal it. The reason that the Peloponnesian War lasted so long is that for the most part, it was a stalemate. The Spartans dominated on land and the Athenians dominated on sea. The Spartans didn't really have a navy, certainly not one that could go toe-to-toe with the Athenians. To facilitate war as a gameplay mechanic, the Athenians are given a massive buff on land and the Spartans are given a massive buff on sea, because if they weren't, there wouldn't be this back-and-forth feeling that communicates the idea of an ongoing war. A real war isn't nearly as dramatic. Athens spent a whole lot of time under siege, which is even represented in the game with the Spartans camped right outside the walls. But they can't get in, and the siege isn't effective because they can't block the trade routes from the seas, so the city is still being well supplied. Thus, a 30-year stalemate. In creating this more dynamic forever war, the game also heavily obfuscates the politics behind the war. It's not quite the same as Syndicate's apolitical wonderland, even though this is a lot of the same team. This whole situation in Athens especially is rife with political commentary. I mean, you don't need to be a genius to figure out who Pericles and Cleon represent, a well-meaning but ultimately inefficient moderate versus an extremist who appeals to bigotry and hatred.
I will make Athens great again!
Yeah, I got it, thanks. The game gets into the politics of individuals, but it doesn't really linger on the politics of nations, of why Athens and Sparta are actually at war. This is so you can switch sides throughout the story without it being a big deal, because if you knew the reasons behind the war, you might have a preference on which side to fight for. Essentially, Athenians were expansionist imperialists who spread democracy by force, and Spartans were slavist monarchists who spread freedom by choice. I mean, Athens also had slavery, but, less of it than Sparta. History is weird and contradictory like that. In the game, it's just the cult's fault. They're perpetuating the war because the chaos helps them grab power. From a player perspective, you are kind of biased against Sparta because Cassandra is understandably resentful of Sparta after what happened to her as a kid, but also because all of the fun NPCs like Socrates and Alcibiades live in Athens. The Spartans do get Brasidas, who is introduced in one of the most badass cutscenes in the whole game, but he's a lot more relevant in Season 2 when Sparta takes centre stage. Season 1 is all centred around Athens. Of course, the biggest Spartan trireme is going to be staring at you front and centre throughout the whole game, at least assuming that you make the correct decision in character creation, because, of course, Cassandra is a woman. I find Odyssey's character selection to be one of the most interesting in all of video games. I even made a whole video about it a few years ago. There's so much going on behind the scenes of this choice, so let me start by explaining that there is, in fact, a wrong choice. As revealed by the 2020 reports, this is the last time I'm going to say that, I promise, Cassandra was originally intended to be the protagonist of the game. There wasn't supposed to be a choice. And going forward in the series, Cassandra is the canonical protagonist that gets referenced and even shows up in future games. If you choose Alexios, you're choosing wrong. The choice was, of course, an executive decision based on the logic that women don't sell. That's why, despite not actually being the real protagonist, Alexios gets to be on the front of the box. The irony that this game released a year after Wonder Woman is, I'm sure, not lost on anyone. Here we get the double twist though, because if we look at statistics, roughly 2/3 of the player base chose Alexios, which means about 66% of players played the wrong game. That implies that Ubisoft were correct to offer the choice, because when given the choice, the majority of players would rather play as a man, right? That's certainly how some less than reputable news sources framed the reveal of those statistics. That is what is so devious about this choice. It frames an inherently unprogressive addition as progress. A choice is certainly more progressive than just having men be the default, but it's actually a lot less progressive than fully committing to a female protagonist. Because reframed with the knowledge that Cassandra is the real protagonist, Alexios doesn't become a choice, he becomes an opt-out button. An opt-out button which necessarily robs Cassandra's story of a lot of the gravitas and drama that it should have. Because ancient Greece was a deeply sexist time period, especially in Athens. Odyssey does present another egalitarian wonderland, although not quite as obviously as Syndicate did. Racism and sexism do exist in this world, but only on the sidelines, just off camera left. It's not something that the game ever focuses on. For example, most Greeks in the game really hate Persians, but the game just kind of sidesteps the whole issue by not really having any Persians in the game aside from one. At least not until the DLC, but we'll get to that later. Cassandra being a woman should have a massive impact on the story, it should cause problems, and it does very occasionally come up.
We've sent out a couple of patrols, but they never returned, and we can't spare any more men at this time.
Sometimes you're better sending a woman anyway.
For the most part though, the role of the Eagle Bearer is written from a completely gender-neutral perspective, because of course it is. Most players are going to be a dude, and the limitations of game design mean that you can't have a radically different game for each protagonist. This isn't a problem in most RPGs, because most RPGs are set in a sci-fi or fantasy setting where sexism can just be ignored. But then we get onto a whole other issue, which is that Cassandra and Alexios are in fact different people. This isn't like Commander Shepard, where male or female, you're still Commander Shepard. Cassandra and Alexios are two different individuals with different names, different scars, which imply different history. And while they share 90% of the same dialogue, their delivery of that dialogue can be entirely different. It's actually a great example of how important acting is to how a character comes across. To boil it down, Alexios leans into exaggeration, embracing the Greek hero archetype, and Cassandra leans into subtlety, giving a much more down-to-earth performance. And these two approaches completely change how the character comes across. The most common place this comes up is in sarcasm, at least in the places where Cassandra is clearly being sarcastic and the humour comes from her sassiness. Alexios is being serious and the humour is in his braggart confidence.
You should have thought of that when you borrowed drachmi, Thuris.
But my family...
It's hot. I'm in a bad mood. And you're going to pay. We both know it. The question is, what do I break first? You or your merchandise?
You should have thought of that when you borrowed drachmi, Thuris.
But my family...
It's hot. I'm in a bad mood. And you are going to pay. We both know it. Now the question is, what do I break first? You? Or your merchandise?
This is an example from very early in the game, but I think it's illustrative of the general idea. The delivery changes the tone of the scene and the dynamics at play. Alexios' threat is serious, he's angry, he's puffing out his chest in intimidation. Cassandra's threat is exasperated, like she doesn't even want to be here and is just going through the motions. It implies that this is not the first time she's been at this shop threatening this dude. I can't pretend I don't have a massive bias between the two. Having played through the whole game twice now with Cassandra, seeing Alexios in the lead role just looks weird to me. But in many ways, I do genuinely think that Cassandra is a much stronger protagonist, both from her delivery and the ways that the world interacts with her. It just adds something to the story that she's a woman. Granted, I didn't play through the whole game again with Alexios because I don't hate myself, but I played enough to get the general vibe. Alexios is fine, a perfectly serviceable protagonist in line with a Jacob or an Edward or, dare I say, an Ezio. Cassandra brings an extra spark. First of all, her design is perfect. She's not a perfectly glamorous Barbie doll, she is built like a brick. She stands about a foot taller than most NPCs in the game and has the physique of an Olympian, and that's awesome. She looks believably like a woman who could beat the shit out of you in a way that so many female protagonists, even really good ones, just don't. The more down-to-earth performance that Cassandra's voice actor delivers also grounds the character regardless of the crazy places the story ends up. Cassandra always feels like a real person, whether she's fighting pirates or mythical creatures, in a way that Alexios often doesn't. He comes across more as a cartoon character. There are elements of the story that just work better with Cassandra too, like Phoebe. It's just more natural that Phoebe would look up to Cassandra as an inspiration because they're both girls in a man's world. The same applies to the relationship between Cassandra and her mum. Speaking of which, it makes the choice to make the main character a Spartan work beyond just being the cool warrior dudes everyone knows. The Greek world would frown upon teaching a woman to fight. Except in Sparta, because, it's Sparta. Everyone was expected to know how to fight. That was their whole entire deal. It's one of those great and weird contradictions of history that Sparta, a society built on an underclass of people with no rights who do all the work, was also the place where the genders were more equal than anywhere else in Greece. A sharp contrast to Athens and its love of democracy, which women were not allowed to participate in because they basically had no rights. Even if none of the dialogue is different, there is a layer of subtext that is present with Cassandra that just isn't there with Alexios. It's the peak of hypocrisy that Athens will hire a female mercenary to help them win a war, but won't actually allow a woman to join the army. And that hypocrisy says something about Athens. It says something about the role of women in warfare and how sexism is often a matter of convenience. Easy to do when you have the power, harder to do when the woman obviously has more power than you. Even if it's not completely accurate to history, it has some bite to it that's just not there with Alexios. Odyssey with Cassandra is a more interesting, more progressive, and frankly, better game. And it's a game that only a third of players played, because when offered the choice, they chose a man. That's not their fault. It's well known that most players will pick their own gender in this situation, and apparently most of the Assassin's Creed fanbase is men. Ubisoft certainly knows that. That's why they forced in the choice. It hamstrings the optics of having a female-led game and lets them hide behind Alexios' manly man muscles. People will play a game led by a character of a different gender. People do it all the time. Half the population has been forced to it for decades. I would hope that most men can handle role-playing as a woman for a while without shattering their masculinity. Otherwise, all of your stories are going to be boring, safe, and the same. Unless this just become the Alexios bully zone, I even think Alexios contributes to the reasons why Cassandra is a better choice. We just have to talk about the twist for that.
Elpinor is dead. One of you is a traitor. The artifact will expose them.
The in-universe explanation for why you can pick between two different people is that both of them are real. Layla, who's back by the way, is using Leonidas' spear to access the memories, but because the DNA is so old and degraded, the Animus is having to do a lot of guesswork to fill in the blanks. So you have to decide which DNA strand you want to follow. Whichever character you don't choose is the baby that's being sacrificed in the flashback, and just like the main character, they don't actually die either. Instead, they were taken in by the cult to be raised as their ultimate warrior. Deimos. For all the reasons that he's less interesting as a hero, Alexios is more interesting as a villain. The theatricality that he brings is much better suited to this villainous role because now it has some menace. This is a guy who absolutely believes his own bullshit and will crush your head like a melon if you dare to correct him. It's playing with these hyper-aggressive, toxic masculine ideas that Cassandra in the same role just doesn't tap into. She does okay, but she's not nearly as menacing. Plus the visual of Deimos backhanding the hero, it just, shall we say, it hits differently this way. Deimos shows up throughout the story as a dark reflection of Cassandra. Just like Cassandra, he's descended from the Isu and he has a magic weapon of his own, a sword. Using the other player character to fill this role is a very interesting use case that almost justifies giving the choice, but I'd still cut it out if I could. It's Deimos who kills Pericles, having a great time while doing it, because one of the big RPG elements of the base game is if you're going to try and redeem Deimos, or if you're going to decide that he's too far gone. This heightened family melodrama is absolutely in keeping with a Greek legend. They're full of this sort of stuff. Prophecies of killing fathers and brothers and daughters and sons. Season 1 ends on that dark note. Phoebe is dead, Pericles and a third of Athens is dead, and the cult now control Athens. So, Season 2 picks up with the tonal opposite of everything. Myrine is on the island of Naxos, so you sail away from the dead streets of Athens through a bitter and stormy night and emerge far away on a paradise island and finally start that family reunion. After spending a whole season looking for her, it's a relief to find out that Myrine is a great character in her own right. She's a woman who's gone through an immense amount of trauma, but that was a long time ago, and she's managed to put her life back together again. She's the leader of Naxos under the alias of Phoenix, kind when she should be, quick to put down her enemies with that Spartan training when she has to be. A detail that I love is that just because they're reunited and it's all happy doesn't mean that Marini and Cassandra always agree on everything. Despite it all, Marini still considers herself a Spartan, even if she left. Sparta is her home, and she has a great respect for Spartan culture and Spartan warriors. Cassandra is not nearly as loyal to Sparta, and you can defer to Marini if you want, but it's much more dynamic to push back a little on her reverence for the homeland which tried to kill her kids, even if they both miraculously survived. After spending an episode in Naxos helping Marini win the local war against Paros, it's back to Sparta you go. For one, because Marini wants to go back, now that she knows both her kids are alive, and potentially her husband too, depending on your choices. She wants to try her hand at a family reunion in the old house. But while you're on Naxos, you also learn that one of the two kings of Sparta is a member of the cult, and with both sides of the war controlled by the cult, the war is never going to end. This is the structure of Season 2, reclaiming your family home and uncovering the cultist king. The kings assign you 2 tasks before you can reclaim your home, plus there's some business up in Arcadia that Marini wants to investigate. So, here the narrative branches off a second time, 3 more episodes across 3 more regions: Arcadia, Boethia, and Elis. Elis is by far the silliest episode in the whole game, and I love it for that. Elis is the home of the Olympics, the original Olympics. Despite the entire Greek world being at war, there is a truce in the Olympic Valley. We're just here for the sports. The king wants you to escort their champion to the Olympics and make sure he takes back the gold, although back in the day it was a laurel, not a medal. His name is Testicles, and he's a big drunk idiot. Obviously, the first thing that happens when you get to Elis is that he stumbles off the dock and gets eaten by sharks, forcing you to take his place. This is one situation in the game where Cassandra being a woman does cause a big Spartan Trireme moment, because women were not allowed to compete in the Olympics. They weren't even allowed to watch them, lest their lustful gaze be drawn to all the sexy naked men around. That's not a joke. All of the athletes had to compete completely naked. I can see why maybe that particular rule got the axe from the game. There was one big exception to this no women rule, and she's actually in the game, which raises a whole lot more questions than if they had just omitted it. A lady called Kalapatira snuck into the stands dressed as a man so she could watch her son compete, but when she cheered too enthusiastically, everyone noticed that she was a woman. The punishment for this was execution, but she managed to escape her fate because she was descended from a long line of Olympic champions. So they felt she had enough history with the Olympics to stay her execution, just don't do it again. I'm totally for including this story in the game because it's interesting and it's another example of the great and weird hypocrisies of history. The person demanding her execution is the one other woman allowed to watch the Olympics, the priestess of Demeter, because she's immune to the lustful allure of all these sexy men you see. It's just very weird to do this quest as Cassandra, who's currently competing in the Olympics with no pushback whatsoever. There are other female athletes around the place too, so we're in this very strange between zone where apparently it's perfectly fine for women to compete in the Olympics, but not for them to watch.
What crime has this woman committed?
Exactly that. Her crime is that she is a woman.
It's news to me that's now a crime. Shouldn't you lock yourself up first, then?
Ultimately, this doesn't bother me too much, and I still enjoy the lighthearted tone of the episode. There's a whole side quest where you just go on a tour with Barnabas as he geeks out over all the Olympic stuff. It's delightful. I just wish it had been acknowledged by the script. There's any number of ways you could write around this, like Cassandra making an appeal to the judges, or using some kind of loophole in the rules about replacements, or just pretending that she is Testicles and daring anyone to try and prove otherwise. But these special exceptions would require commitment to Cassandra that we can't make because of Alexios. It swings the other way too. One of the major side quests in the game revolves around a faction called the Daughters of Artemis, a group of all-women hunters who commit themselves to Artemis, the goddess of the hunt. They're not necessarily a representation of a real group, definitely not as large as presented in the game, but Artemis did have a lot of female followers, including the one lady amongst Greek heroes, Atalanta. The woman raised by bears who slayed the Caledonian boar, the clear inspiration for this whole questline. The Daughters are framed in several side quests around the map as a sort of escape for the women of Greece fed up with the sexist society they live under. Just reject it all and go live in the woods. By hunting down the legendary animals around the map, eventually you can become the leaders of the Daughters in ritual combat with the Elder, after which all of the Daughters on the map become non-hostile and you can even get them to crew your ship. This whole setup just makes no sense as Alexios. There is absolutely no reason that an entirely female organisation made up of, let's be clear, almost entirely lesbians would accept Alexios as their king. There is a very apparent hatred and distrust of men running through a lot of the Daughters' questlines, and so Alexios becoming their leader just has major ick vibes in a way which Cassandra doesn't. The other 2 episodes of Season 2 are not as fun as Ellis. Boethia especially is a bit of a slog. It's essentially a repeat of Megaris, with you working with your stepbrother Stentor to take over the region. The main problem is that Stentor kind of sucks. He's a self-important jackass with basically no redeeming qualities. You end up killing him at the end of this episode if you didn't spare Nikolaos. Self-entitled jackass describes a lot of the Spartans in the game, to be honest, which is another reason the game feels kind of biased towards Athens. The exception is Brasidas, who's written to be as chill and cool as possible to make sure that you have at least one friendly face in Sparta. And I do like Brasidas, even if he does get a little pissy if you don't follow his plans. Once you've dealt with the cultist king and reclaimed your family home, it's time for Season 3, which is definitely the shortest season, but no less important. It's the season that officially wraps up the Deimos plotline. It only really has one full episode within it, a third trip to Athens where you help Socrates and the gang undermine Cleon's power, but it's bookended by 2 fights against Deimos on the battlefield, and in the second he kills Brasidas. Very casually too. Is now too much to redeem him, now that he's killed Brasidas? The family Odyssey will always end with a scene around the dinner table, and depending on your choices throughout the game, there are 9 potential combinations that could be here. If you spared Nikolaos and told him to check on his son, then Stentor will be here. If you were able to redeem Deimos, then he'll be here. If you try and fail to redeem him, then he'll kill Marini in the last moment, which could lead to a very awkward dinner of just you and Nikolaos. I got what's considered the best ending, the whole family back together again. I chose to redeem Deimos because despite all he did, he's still my brother. He's been lied to, abused, and manipulated all his life. That doesn't excuse what he's done, but it doesn't mean he can't make up for his mistakes either. It's an interesting ending because it's only one of many in the game. As you might be able to tell from the runtime, the end of this story is hardly the end of Assassin's Creed Odyssey. There are 2 more endings before we even get into the DLC. There's plenty of stuff left to do. The main story only runs you through about a quarter of the cultists on the map, and it doesn't even scratch the surface of Cassandra's true destiny as a Greek hero. That comes from a much stranger source. The game splits its main narratives into 3 categories. The biggest and longest is the family reunion story. The second is hunting down the cult of Cosmos, and the third is Atlantis. After you find Marini, but before heading to Sparta, she tells you where to find your real father. He's on the abandoned island of Thera. What you find there after some light puzzles is the lost city of Atlantis, and inside is your real dad, Pythagoras, the Triangle Man himself. He's about 150 years old at this point, but he's being kept alive by a magic staff, the staff of Hermes Trismegistus. He tells Cassandra, rather bluntly, that he arranged to conceive her with Marini to ensure that her bloodline would be strong enough to do what needs to be done and seal away the secrets of Atlantis. We'll get more into this blood purity stuff later, don't worry. This is how the game ties in all of the First Civilization stuff, much more directly and with a much bigger focus than any of the last several games. In fact, Layla's storyline isn't tied to Cassandra's family drama at all. Her story is all about Atlantis. Layla is still very boring, unfortunately, but Odyssey gets the notable honour of taking her story in an absolutely bizarre direction, which is better than being forgettable, I suppose. Like Origins, her sections make up a tiny fraction of the overall runtime of the game, and this time they're primarily populated with arguments with her doctor friend Victoria. A constant back and forth of, you should take a break from the Animus, but we're so close to finding the truth. Layla having an actual goal this time around is an improvement, where in Origins there was no clear reason to be in the Animus. She wasn't looking for anything. This time she does have a goal. She's looking for the staff that Pythagoras is holding, and she knows that Cassandra ends up with it eventually. She just wants to know how, why, and where. Locking up the secrets of Atlantis means travelling the world and finding 4 separate artifacts, each of which is being guarded by a monster. I actually love the way these are integrated into the world. Each of them has a small quest chain before you get to them, and the first time it's not apparent what you're going to find there. So when suddenly a talking sphinx appears before you and starts asking you riddles, it is a genuine surprise. Like Bayek in Origins, Cassandra isn't too shocked to see a sphinx or a cyclops or a minotaur because these things are just known to exist in ancient Greece. And by this point in the story, she has more or less accepted that she's a Greek hero whether she likes it or not. Killing mythical monsters is just what you gotta do sometimes. After killing each monster, Cassandra rips out a piece of them, which then transforms into an Apple of Eden, along with some sort of echo or wish, at which point the body is revealed to be a shriveled husk of some long ago person. This is fully explained much later in the Fate of Atlantis DLC, but it's clear that these monsters are not real, but some kind of transformation gone wrong. There is a risk with any ancient secret civilizations, like the first civilization, of explaining too much and just making them boring and or stupid. For a lot of people, Odyssey is where the series crosses that threshold, giving them a name, introducing a bunch of Isu characters, and pulling back the curtain on a lot of stuff. I actually appreciate how they're used in this game a lot more than the previous games, because they're used as actual people and not as weird cryptic nonsense machines. That's why Juno was always the most interesting of them. Each artifact you return to Atlantis is accompanied by a message, much like the messages in Origins, but this time with a new narrator, Aletheia, the Greek goddess of truth, who actually opens the first message by making fun of how cryptic and confusing the messages in Origins were.
Acquiring contemporaneity. Acquiring a voice, that's what. I'm taking over your recordings. The humans have had enough of your pompous speeches.
Aletheia's straight-talking, cutting-through-the-bullshit approach is honestly, to me, a breath of fresh air after over a decade of cryptic nothings around the First Civilization. If they're going to keep this around as a plot element, I personally would rather they expand on the ideas and start explaining things instead of keeping it all vague. Vague is only interesting for so long. I've always found them to be the weakest part of the series, but in Odyssey at least, I actually kind of care, because ultimately the story of the ESO is still the story of people, and that gives it a human edge that's easier to engage with. For all the talk of Greek heroes and magic, Odyssey actually leans into sci-fi way harder than most games in the series. It would make Desolate proud, I'm sure. Instead of just leaving it all vague, it actually gets into the technobabble nonsense of how things like the Apples of Eden work, and why other artifacts like the Shroud and Syndicate were made in the first place. That's much more for the big DLC expansions though. In fact, the entire Atlantis storyline in the base game is pretty much all just set up for that DLC. Season 5 being set up here in the margins of Seasons 2 and 3. Within the base game, the ending of this storyline is absolutely bizarre, and I had a pretty significant allergic reaction to it the first go around. With all the context that the DLC adds to it, it goes down much better, but it is still quite baffling. After collecting all 4 artifacts, it's time to seal Atlantis, but Pythagoras has a change of heart, wanting instead to spend more time studying the place, learning more ancient secrets. You can fight him for the staff, or you can just convince him to give it to you, but either way Cassandra ends up with the staff. So Cassandra is now immortal. Before you even have time to process that, it cuts back to the present day, where Layla, who's now in Atlantis herself, does a few slide puzzles to open Atlantis again. And then Cassandra walks up, in the present day, wearing a fancy suit. It's a bonkers visual, and like all Layla scenes, it's a short scene, so you only get to ask her like 3 questions before she hands Layla the staff and immediately dies. It's so absolutely jarring, but my absolute favourite, the height of absurdity, is what happens directly after this.
There's so much of the story I haven't seen. I should go back to the Animus and visit Cassandra again.
The body isn't even cold yet, Layla. Give me a moment to grieve, why don't you? Now, in a certain sense, you know that all the characters in every Assassin's Creed game are dead, because they're set in the past. Of course they're long dead. It just feels a little different to see the character die right in front of you and then dive back into their life and continue adventuring like nothing happened. Depending on the order you do things, you could have dozens of hours left of Cassandra's story. In fact, you can't even start the Fate of Atlantis DLC until you've seen this ending. Surprisingly, the DLC really does justify this ending and even manages to make it kind of a fitting end for Cassandra's story. I'm as shocked as you. It's just that delivered out of order like this, it completely falls apart as a dramatic beat. It's honestly more funny than it is sad because it's just so out of left field. When I first played the game, I felt like this ending completely undermined the last 70 hours of story. What did it matter that I reunited Cassandra's family if she was destined to outlive them by 2,500 years? I've softened on that perspective since. I think a happy ending is still worthwhile, even if you know it won't last forever. Life is about the journey and all that. It adds to what the DLC will build upon, which is that being immortal can be more of a curse than a blessing. There is about a third of the open world that the main story won't take you to. The vast majority of the Greek islands are reserved purely for side content, but that doesn't make them any less polished or any less important to the overall impact of the game. Each island, especially the bigger ones, are just another episode of the series. Episodes that don't progress the main plot exactly, but still have their own stories, themes and tones. The island of Mykonos, for example, is a whole mini-campaign about a revolution mediated between the local revolutionaries and a detachment of Spartans sent to assist them in ousting the Athenians. Euobia's story is centred around slavery, how it functioned as part of ancient Greek society, and how different people feel about it and react to its existence. Pefka on Crete is another sillier episode revolving around a fake Minotaur scam, which is extra fun if you happen to have already killed the real Minotaur.
Don't need the tour. Already killed the beast.
You think you... you killed the... the Minotaur?
It was an epic battle. Lots of blood.
An epic battle with a man in a mask? You were scammed, warrior. But
But have no fear, you're in Befka now, a land famous for its honesty and total lack of scams.
All of these secondary locations are still technically incorporated back into the main plot because of the cult of Cosmos. They have their hands in every part of the Greek world, and pretty much all of the major side quest chains end with a cultist. The cult screen is one of my favourite parts of the game, actually. There's a pivot away from having direct villains and into fighting against a giant, sprawling organisation. There's something methodical about it. First you have to uncover the cultist's identity, and then you have to go and hunt them down. Sometimes via a side quest chain, but often by engaging in some other more minor game system, like cultists will show up if you fight for a certain side in the region's conquest battle. The cult is arranged into a hierarchy. There are 7 branches, each led by a sage, and as you kill the lower ranking members, you'll uncover the identity of the sages. And as you kill the sages, you'll uncover clues to the identity of the person behind it all, the ghost of Cosmos. Only some of these cultists, like Cleon for example, are actual characters with depth and a story role. Most of them are just targets with a brief description, which would lead some people to seeing this as nothing more than busy work, and I can understand that. I guess I'm just a fan of busy work sometimes. The identity of the ghost is quite easy to guess, even after only a couple of clues. In fact, basically as soon as you see that it's a woman, you can make a pretty good guess. Once you've found all the clues and meet the ghost back where it all began, in the chamber under the Oracle of Delphi, it is indeed revealed to be Aspasia, the wife of Pericles. The reveal doesn't have as much bite as it feels like it should, because Aspasia is a very important character in Season 1, but she disappears from the story completely after you leave Naxos, with no appearances in Season 2 or 3. She's also not actually evil. She let you wipe out the cult and even helped you do it because she realised that their plan wasn't working and wants to try something new. The Cult of Cosmos are not an ancestor to the Templars like the Order of Ancients was. They don't have any high and mighty intentions of world peace. They just want power for power's sake. They're actually ideologically opposed to the Templars that way. The Templars want supreme order. The cult thrives in chaos. Aspasia did have more lofty intentions, but when she realised that the rest of the cultists didn't, she decided to let them all die. The cult are obsessed with bloodlines, Cassandra's bloodline in particular, the blood of the Isu. They both worship it and despise it because of its inherent superiority over regular mortals. The game's obsession in general with how good Cassandra's blood is can come across as pretty ick sometimes. It does pay off eventually in the DLC when it actually amounts to an interesting plot point, but until then there's just a whole lot of chat about how genetically superior Cassandra is, and I'm not a fan, frankly. Aspasia had intended to kill Cassandra, but when she saw that she wasn't insane like Deimos, she changed her mind and quietly watched as she eliminated the cult. You can kill Aspasia here if you want, or you can smooch her, or you can just let her walk away. The real part of the ending is when you touch the Oracle device at the centre and get a flash forward into the future. It will actually spoil the Atlantis ending if you haven't done that yet. The cult may be gone, but the conflict continues ever onwards, and it's Cassandra's burden to watch it all, until she can finally pass the staff to the next owner, who might be finally able to end it all, but that's a story for never, I think. Valhalla goes in a different direction again with Layla, but we'll get to that later. This is intended to be the very last beat of the main story of Odyssey, but it was never intended to be the final ending of the game. Even in its construction, it's a tease of things to come, both in the clips it shows of previous Assassin's Creed games, and for the parts of Cassandra's long, long life that we're yet to see.
Here, visitor. You are about to embark on a journey of discovery through the rich and fascinating history of classical Greece. You'll become fully immersed in the painstakingly detailed world built for Assassin's Creed Odyssey, which you are free to explore at your own pace, without any danger or time pressure.
Before we dive back into that life though, we should take Dr. Victoria's advice and spend some time in the real world. Like Origins, Odyssey got its own Discovery Tour, released separately as an entirely separate educational product. In many ways it's better than the one in Origins, and in many ways it has all of the exact same problems. The biggest improvement is in the amount of information it gives you, way more than the brief overviews of Origins. When you click the more information button, it actually gives you more information, not just a transcript of the narration. Big progress there. The whole thing is more gamified in a way that I really appreciate because it makes the whole thing more engaging. You unlock new rewards in the form of new characters and mounts for completing tours, and there's a much bigger focus on discovery to go along with the name. Dotted around the map are dozens of discovery locations that are separate from the guided tours but give you more information about the place. A similar feature to this is actually integrated into the main game. When you uncover a historical location, you'll get a little pop-up, and if you go to a special filter on the map, you can read a little blurb about that place. Discovery Tour takes that little bonus feature and centers the entire game world around it. When it comes to certain places, like, for example, the Petrified Forest where the Medusa lives in the base game, there are special blue discoveries to find, which are behind-the-scenes information on the art direction of the game and the decisions behind it, a touch which I love because behind-the-scenes glimpses are so rare in video games. The tours themselves are much better because they manage to find a couple of narrators that actually sound interested in what they're talking about, and they're bookended by a character relevant to the tour. So, for example, the tour at the Battle of Thermopylae is introduced to you by Leonidas himself. You can also ask them for a quiz at the end, which feels like a very edutainment touch, but it's still another aspect of the gamification that I appreciate. Because I'm me, I immediately looked for the most boring sounding tour possible, which I figured was going to be the tour on perfume. But even that was an improvement over the pottery tour from last time because it had more information delivered with a lot more charisma. And it was bookended by Marcos making stupid jokes about perfume.
A word of advice from a former perfume peddler. Never start your sales pitch with, "You smell like you could use some perfume." It has a surprisingly low success rate.
I still ultimately see the whole endeavour as a vanity project. When I take the perfume tour, I'm not really learning more about perfume, but I am admiring the skill and craft of the artist that made this entire perfumery that I ran past in the base game without a second thought. It was always there, you can go look at it if you want, it's just a completely minor background detail. I love the games for that, I really do. And just like with Origins, I'm happy all the artists and historians get a chance to show off all the crazy and specific work they did to bring this world to life. You might have noticed that I've said quite a few times now that the DLC will explain this or that, and that's because Odyssey is the series' first proper forte into live service design. As big and expansive as the base game is, it was always designed to be a platform for more and more content to be added to. Like any warm-blooded game critic, I absolutely hate the live service model, but Odyssey is a rare example of actually being done successfully and not in the shittiest, most money-hungry way possible, which is impressive considering we're talking about Ubisoft. I suppose there's only so much you can get away with in a single-player game. There is a huge and complicated amount of tiers we're working with here, from weekly drops of new high-level ships on the map to the major DLC expansions which were released episodically. I should be clear by now, that's actually pretty in keeping with the story structure of the rest of the game. In between these major paid DLC releases were what they called Lost Tales of Greece, smaller, free expansions that are basically plus-sized side quests. They're about 40 minutes each, and there's a whole lot of them, 10 in total. In fact, added all together, they're actually a little longer than Legacy of the First Blade. The difference is in quality and cohesion. There is no shared narrative between the Lost Tales, they're all totally separate stories and they vary massively in quality. They sort of feel like every writer on the team just got a chance to write whatever story they wanted. Some came out great, some not so much. There's a bunch of them that just aren't really worth mentioning at all, like the one where you seduce two brothers, or the one where you meet Praxilla the poet and she's kind of a cow, or the one where you put on a play. Some of them are a little more in-depth, like the one starring Socrates where he gets put on trial and you also meet a little baby Plato, or the one where you find a village who worships Cassandra as a god and you have to try and navigate that weird situation. One of them is just pure comedy, where every quest you do ends in a spectacular failure, which makes everything worse. Others, particularly the ones for Barnabas and Herodotus, are just genuinely great, expanding the backstory of both characters and increasing your bond with them in fun ways. Herodotus's especially is unique because you can't access it until you finish the story all the way up to Atlantis, and that's because at the end of The Lost Tale he leaves your ship to go off on his own adventures. It's a good story beat that otherwise feels missing from the base game. I don't think live service is inherently sinister. For use cases like this, I think there is some merit. The Lost Tales are not necessary to enjoy Odyssey, but they're here anyway, and they're free, and they give players some new stuff to do every few weeks instead of uninstalling the game. At the very lowest rung of narrative content in Odyssey, there is a system for infinitely repeatable, procedurally generated quests. Basically the exact same thing everyone hated back in Fallout 4, another settlement needs your help to your stuff. Content for the sake of content. But to actually hit the point where you're engaging with those quests, especially in the face of all this added free story DLC, you're not just scraping the bottom of the barrel, you're actually scraping the floor underneath the barrel, having scraped all the way through the barrel at that point. That kind of content is for a player a lot more committed than me, a level of commitment that I can barely even comprehend. But I don't doubt those players are out there, even to this day. Is all this free story DLC still a sneaky tactic to get more money out of you? Of course it is. The longer you play the game, the more statistically likely it is you'll spend some cash in the cosmetic store. But in general, I find it pretty hard to complain about stuff that is completely free.
Are we that desperate? We're helping somebody move?
What? The guy's got a lot of stuff. Work is work, and a few extra drachmi never hurt anybody. Sometimes, even the simplest things can be worthy of our attention.
That is much more worthy of my attention, Barnabas.
Thankfully, I do not have the same struggle to complain about things that I paid for. Legacy of the First Blade was the first major story expansion released, and it is in my opinion the worst part of Assassin's Creed Odyssey by a pretty wide margin. It centres, at least in theory, around another one of the statues back in Assassin's Creed 2, a guy called Darius, credited as the first person to use a hidden blade with which he killed King Xerxes of Persia. And Darius is pretty cool, he's just not actually the focus of the DLC. Odyssey splits its two major DLC packs exactly the same way that Origins did. The first one is supposed to link the game better with the future Assassin's Creed games, and then the second one delves into the mythology. However, comparing Legacy of the First Blade to the hidden ones, it comes up real short. Legacy doesn't add any new areas to the open world, instead it adds narrative content to 3 regions of the map that didn't have any before: Macedonia, Achaea, and Messenia, which feels a little cheap considering that this DLC costs more than the hidden ones did. The open world didn't feel empty with these locations missing quest content because it's just 3 regions amongst dozens, but it still feels a bit scummy to withhold stuff just to pay more for it later. There are 2 conflicting things happening in Legacy of the First Blade. One of them is okay, and one of them I hate more than life itself. The okay side of the DLC is Darius and his nemesis. Darius and his son have fled Persia being pursued by the Order of the Ancients back from Origins. The Order get their own screen like the cult screen, so the DLC adds a bunch of new targets to hunt down from the second separate secret organisation. The Order is also specifically after Cassandra because of her magic blood, or as they describe her, a tainted one, which is nice because at least this time the guys obsessed with blood purity are the bad guys. So Cassandra teams up with Darius and Natakis to take the Order down. The other half of the story, which takes on bigger and bigger focus as the DLC progresses, is a doomed love story between Cassandra and Natakis. And despite my love of love stories, I don't think I've ever been more annoyed by a story element in the whole series than by the way this unfolds. Natakis is just about the blandest man I've ever seen in my entire life. He's extremely boring, but the game wants to insist to me that Cassandra is falling madly in love with this brown paper bag of a man. It makes an especially great combination with the Amazonian armour I was wearing by this point, because here's this radiant, statuesque demigod and she's head over heels for this guy who looks like he works at a desk all day. I mean, no disrespect, I work at a desk all day, but I wouldn't expect Cassandra to fall in love with me either. I have heard that this dynamic works a lot better with Alexios. If you're playing Alexios, then likewise Natakis is replaced by his sister, and I can see how that might feel like a more natural fit, although I think it would be much funnier if they didn't switch, because the bigger issue with all of this is that it's not optional. You can fight against this romance all you want, but it's going to happen whether you like it or not, because by the end of episode 2, Cassandra and Natakis are going to have a baby, because rescuing that baby is the whole plot of episode 3. I just hate everything about the way this plays out. It's terribly integrated into the main story for one thing. There's not really a good time to play it. It seems like it's supposed to be played before the end of the main story, but then you run into this weird issue of Cassandra taking a year off the hunt to find her family to start a completely new family. But it's definitely worse to play after the main story, because then you have so many of these family scenes that should clearly involve Marini and the rest of Cassandra's family, but don't, because there are 9 potential endings to that story, and the DLC just doesn't want to account for that. Once you complete the game, whichever family you've managed to reunite will become legendary lieutenants for your ship, so you can get this hilarious dissonance where Cassandra feels like she's all alone trying to rescue her son. Meanwhile, her family of Spartan warriors are just stood on the ship twiddling their thumbs. But my bigger issue is the way that Cassandra is written in this DLC. Romance is an optional element of the role-playing throughout the base game, but it's never suggested to be anything more than flings and hookups. You can romance men and women of all shapes and sizes, which isn't actually ahistorical because ancient Greece didn't quite conceptualise gay and straight the same way we do. You can join an orgy with Alcibiades if you want to, that's just the way Cassandra swings. The DLC has this scene where Cassandra tells Darius that she dreams of going fishing with her son one day, a peaceful life. This is actually a reference to something Leonidas says way back in the cold open of the game where you briefly play as him during the Battle of 300, but it's totally inconsistent with the Cassandra scene throughout the rest of the game. Depending on how you've played, Cassandra has many potential partners she could have settled down with that she has a lot more chemistry with than Natakis, but she doesn't. One of the Lost Tales even offers Cassandra this exact opportunity, when she runs into an old flame who now has a son of her own, and she offers Cassandra the option to stay and settle down, but Cassandra says no, because that's not who she is. She doesn't want to settle down, she's a wanderer. She had a peaceful life on Kefalonia at the very start of the game, and she left because she was bored. She's an adventurer at heart. The DLC has this weirdly conservative tone where settling down and having kids is the bestest, most important thing anyone can do with their life, and I find it really obnoxious. The original name of the achievement for finishing episode 2 was Growing Up. I'm hardly the only one who had serious problems with this. In fact, when the DLC first came out, it caused a pretty big controversy with the gay community because if you were choosing to play Cassandra as a lesbian, or Alexios as gay, the game forces you into a straight relationship. To fix this, they hilariously patched in an option where you can tell Natakis that you only made a baby with him to secure the bloodline. So your options are now that you did it for a completely forced romance, or you did it for eugenics. Now that's what I call good roleplay. That brings up an interesting question that I probably should have asked before now. Is Assassin's Creed Odyssey a good RPG? And I think the best answer is that mileage may vary. It's not winning any awards for RPG writing, but I do think it's generally pretty good. I think that the RPG mechanics do add an interesting element to the story. It really just depends on what you value in an RPG. If we go back to Argolis, I don't know why all my examples are in Argolis. There's a moment where a priest is trying to heal a sick girl and he asks you to help him by bringing him a white bull to sacrifice for the gods. The bull is already dead, so you just bring back its heart. Just the heart won't be enough to appease the gods, and so the priest asks you to choose who the prayer should be focused towards. The sick girl, the farmer whose bull it was, or the woman whose husband is dying. I really like this example because logically, we both know that this choice is meaningless. Offering a bull's heart to the gods is not going to help any of these people. But if you're engaging with the roleplay and trying to embody Cassandra, then this choice does still matter anyway. You get to decide what Cassandra values most. I personally chose the kid because a little girl on her own seemed like the sort of thing Cassandra would have a lot of sympathy for. I consider this good roleplay even if it has no consequences because the decision itself is still intriguing and compelling. It's the same reason I love arguing with Socrates so much. A good RPG isn't necessarily one that has lots of different potential outcomes. Odyssey's episodic structure and the fact that you're always on the move means that you don't usually see the effects of your decisions, but that doesn't make the decisions any less difficult if you're engaged with the story and not just viewing it as a toy to be played around with. Even the most basic dialogue differences, like starting a quest, do you offer help or do you ask for money, is a great tool for crafting your own story. I, for one, started always asking for money because Cassandra is a working mercenary, but by the time I've finished the main story and have embraced being a Greek hero, asking for money just feels a bit silly. Legacy of the First Blade is an example of what truly bad RPG writing looks like. There is no room for player expression whatsoever. If you have a set idea of what the protagonist is like, it will contradict you and just do what it was going to do anyway. Legacy takes away my control over Cassandra and makes her do things that as co-author of the RPG experience, I don't believe she would do. I mean, at this point in my story, Cassandra is an immortal and she knows it. She's going to vastly outlive any kid she has. It's just a completely out of character thing for her to do. Even within the context of the DLC, it's an incredibly stupid thing to do. Darius and Natakis are always being hunted by the Order, which is why they always stay on the move. But despite knowing that, they decide to risk settling down for a year, and for some reason they don't expect it to end badly for them. To move away from the baby drama, the DLC actually does another thing which I completely hate in all video games, but that Ubisoft seems to love. They built all of Far Cry 5 around it. It calls attention to all the people you kill in the game and tries to make you question if really you're the bad guy. Every time a game does this, it does nothing more than piss me off, because if you wanted to make a point about how murder is bad, you shouldn't have made a game where murder is the only option and main mechanical form of engagement. Aren't you the bad guy for doing the only thing we allowed you to do? It's Baby's first idea of what deep storytelling in a video game is. Isn't it kind of fucked up how many people you kill? If Cassandra was a real person, then yes, it would be. But the contract we implicitly sign in a game like this is that we're not going to think about all the moral implications of killing thousands of people because that's just part of the video game. The only thing drawing attention to it does is make me think about how I'm playing a video game and none of this is real. Besides, any point about murder rings pretty hollow when it's being delivered by a guy who brags about how many people with tainted blood he's murdered. Anything that could make Darius and his rivalry with his old friend Amorgus interesting is completely drowned out in all this nonsense. If Darius was the hero of his own game set in Persia, I would enjoy that a whole lot more than having it shoved into this game where it has no place. The DLC ends the only way it really could, with Darius taking the baby away from Cassandra forever to make sure that it's safe. He takes it to Egypt, where in a montage through the generations we eventually get to Aya. So Aya is a descendant of Cassandra. Neat trivia fact. Definitely worth pissing off all your gay fans and completely contradicting Cassandra's established character for. This is the legacy of the First Blade. Cassandra's legacy isn't any of her heroic deeds. None of them are nearly as important as having a son. It's just such an outdated idea, and the fact that absolutely none of it ever gets referenced again is just the icing on the cake.
Hello, Layla. Heir of memories. We finally found each other.
I guess rebels always find a way. It's nice to meet you in the flesh, Alethea. Or in the hologram?
It was only a matter of time until our realities crossed in one way or another.
If Legacy of the First Blade ever feels like it was made by an entirely different team than the base game, that's because it was. Legacy was developed by Ubisoft Singapore, while the main team worked on the second DLC, The Fate of Atlantis. And let's just say that between the two of them you can tell which one was the Cassandra and which one was the Alexios, if you know what I mean. The first episode of Fate of Atlantis is longer than the entirety of Legacy of the First Blade. It's one of the most ridiculously big DLC expansions I've ever seen, and within that length it's also about 6 billion times better than Legacy in literally every way. It picks up directly where the Atlantis plotline of the base game left off, including continuing the story of Layla. In that way, it really does feel closer to an expansion than a simple DLC. It's the next season, after we spent a season faffing around with Darius and that other guy for some reason. The time for Cassandra to embrace her destiny has come, and Alethea makes a personal appearance to help her on her way. There's about half an hour of boring running around and talking before you can actually get into the meat of the DLC, but once you do, it's well worth it. To teach Cassandra how to use the Staff of Hermes, Alethea has constructed 3 simulations for Cassandra to progress through. I was wrong about simulation theory being gone in this game, by the way. It's back in the margins, and now we're going a 3rd level deep. A simulation within a simulation within a simulation. Alethea has framed these training simulations in a way that Cassandra will easily be able to understand them. After all, what Greek hero story is complete without a quick trip to the afterlife? Episode 1 takes Cassandra to the fields of Elysium, where warriors who died honourably in battle are said to be sin. The domain ruled over by the Greek god Persephone, wife of Hades. This is way more expansive and in-depth than what Origins did with its afterlives. Instead of a small slice, Elysium is a whole new world to explore with its own separate regions. But there's also a big difference in the way it's all presented. The afterlives of Origins were designed to evoke an authentic feeling of Egyptian mythology. They existed exactly as Bayek imagined them to exist. The simulation framing of Odyssey's afterlife muddies this a little bit because mixed in with the mythology is a lot of Assassin's Creed lore. Persephone is somewhere between the actual god of mythology and the Isu of lore, a powerful god-like being, but not technically a god. Within the architecture of the world is also this contradiction. Some of it is purely Greek, and some of it is the weird sci-fi square shapes of all the First Civilization architecture, just in ethereal white instead of the grey we usually see it in. As a creative choice, this makes the most sense in episode 3, which we'll get to, but in the first 2 episodes it's really more confusing than anything else. As Alethea reveals at the very end of the DLC, some of these simulations are based on real events, an animus of sorts based on her own memories. But clearly the afterlife sections aren't real, so was Elysium a real place that Alethea has reframed as the afterlife? Or was Persephone a real Isu who Alethea has moved into this afterlife position? I don't know, and it doesn't really matter, but it's confusing. One of the first people you meet in Elysium has to be real because it's Hermes, and he talks to you about the staff because he's the guy who made it. Learning how to control the staff means seeking out these special shrines on the map, which when activated will unlock special enhanced versions of some of your superpowers, making them even more dangerous. This is essential because all of the enemies in the DLC also use magic against you. They're a significant step up in difficulty from anything in the base game, which here, at the very height of your power, is much appreciated. Learning extra magic powers isn't really what Cassandra is here in these simulations to do, though. That's more of a side benefit. The lesson of all 3 of these simulations is really about how to be an immortal. In terms of RPG design, Elysium has some of the best stuff in the whole game. Because it's a simulation completely untethered from reality, it can push much farther than anything in the base game to much more interesting results. Elysium is meant to be a paradise, but Persephone is a despotic ruler. Particularly, she's keeping Adonis, the most beautiful man alive, according to Greek myth, a prisoner in Elysium because she's in love with him. The feeling is not mutual, and so he's trying to start a revolution against her. This situation is absolutely rife with alternate paths. If you try and romance Adonis or not will determine how Persephone treats him at the end. If you undermine the rebellion or not when working for Persephone will determine how successful the rebellion is. If you're a good friend to Hermes or not will determine if you have to fight him. Hecate, the god of crossroads and witchcraft, is also down here, and each of her quests has a twist that if you don't figure out could change what Persephone does to her by the end of the episode. The episode will always end the same way, with Cassandra being thrown down a big hole into the Nyx simulation, but the journey to get there can be surprisingly diverging. It's clearly Ubisoft pushing the limits of what they can achieve within the RPG systems they've created. The point isn't really to get the best outcome, the point is that there are no good outcomes. Just an endless tangled web of decisions where someone always ends up hurt. No matter what you do, you've made everything worse for someone. It calls into question the value of a personal connection. King Leonidas is down here, of course, he died in honourable combat after all, and Adonis wants to recruit him into the rebellion. Leonidas just wants to go fishing with his family. Later, after he joins the rebellion, Persephone calls you out and tells you to kill him to prove you're not a part of the rebellion. In exchange, she'll bring one of Cassandra's loved ones back to life. Hilariously, Natakis isn't even an option here, even though it would be literally one line of extra dialogue, but frankly, I don't care. I'll pick Phoebe over that guy any day of the week. Is it worth doubly killing your grandpa to revive Phoebe? Do you even trust that Persephone will actually follow through on that promise? Spoilers, she won't. The alternative is to bring her the body of a spy you helped implant in her organisation earlier, an old friend of Hermes and Pythagoras, Kairos of Xarax, who himself considers Cassandra a niece because of his close relationship with Pythagoras. But, you know, you've just met him, and yes, you've just met Leonidas too, but Leonidas has the star power that Kairos of Xarax is lacking. All of this, shockingly, ties back to the core philosophical conflict of Assassin's Creed. Persephone is the Templar Dream Maid manifest. She controls all of Elysium through strict order and mind control. The simulation shows the inherent flaw with this sort of power. There will always be people who, no matter how hard you try or how perfect everything seems, rebel and try to escape, like Adonis, because the will to freedom is human nature. There will also always be people like Hecate who try to claim that power for themselves. With the staff, Cassandra has the power to become this sort of leader, but clearly it wouldn't work out very well.
Rose? Good dog. Good dog. Bad dog!
Elysium is a real high point, and probably the best episode of the DLC. Episode 2, Torment of Hades, in contrast, is clearly the weakest. It's not bad necessarily, but it drags a lot more than Elysium, and that's primarily because of the setting. Persephone kicks Cassandra down a big hole where she lands in the underworld and has to fight the gatekeeper of the realm, Cerberus. Killing Cerberus causes some problems for the king of the underworld, and so Hades enlists you into his service to find some new gate guardians. My big problem with the episode is that Odyssey's underworld is such a bland and generic interpretation. It's all just brown and beige and dreary. Even a fire and brimstone hellscape would be more visually interesting than this. It's also such a generic interpretation of Hades as basically interchangeable with the devil. Most modern interpretations of Hades do more interesting things with the character than just making him a sneering, all-powerful jackass. There is still a lot of good stuff in the episode, but an episode roughly as long as Elysium spent in this dreary dump is a bit of a slog. It's also another experiment in design. If Elysium was pushing the limits of what they could do with an RPG, Hades is an experiment in what they can do with completely open design. After the introduction, there's basically no main story, it's all just side quests and open world activities until the very end. And that lack of direction is a bad combination with a bland environment. The stuff that works is the fun stuff that comes from visiting the afterlife, which is all the familiar faces down there. Phoebe and Brasidas both get a full quest chain exploring their life after death, where you can help them come to terms with their deaths and say goodbye in a more dignified way than you got to in the base game. But the third major side quest comes from a much weirder source. Elpenor, the weird slimy guy who sent you to kill your dad all the way back at the start of the game. He's making an earnest attempt to redeem himself down here in the underworld, and it's up to you to decide if you can forgive him or not, or at the very least acknowledge that his attempt to make up for past mistakes is genuine. One of my favourite characters is Karen the Ferryman. He's back from his original appearance in The Fractured Mind of Clay Kazmarek, and unlike Hades, he actually is a more interesting interpretation because rather than being some ominous figure of death, he's a frustrated and overworked middle manager, really fed up with the fact that someone decided the only way around the afterlife was for one dude to ferry them about the place one at a time. The lesson of this simulation is about saying goodbye, since Cassandra is destined to outlive all of her friends over and over again. It's something she's going to have to get pretty good at. Because of this, despite it being the darkest setting, the episode has the lightest tone. It's a fond farewell to some old friends and some old enemies. It's also another lesson about power. If Persephone followed the Templar school of power, Hades follows the cult of Cosmos, ruling through chaos to the benefit of only himself. This does give him a much firmer grasp on power, but everyone living under it is miserable. With the staff and immortality comes the strong potential to become disconnected from humanity, to eventually view them as nothing more than playthings. The underworld is an example of what will happen if she lets that happen to herself. Even if everyone she forms a connection with eventually dies, she can't stop forming those connections. She needs to stay humble, stay human.
There's no need for that here. You're safe.
I've heard that before.
This place isn't like any other you've been. There's no Persephone, no Hades.
Just you.
Just me.
The third episode of the DLC is a bit weird, as if we haven't crossed weird a while back, but whatever. Even if it is the one that the DLC is actually named after, it's the one where you go to the city of Atlantis in its prime before it ends up as the way you see it back in the main game. It doesn't fit with the other two, which were both realms of the underworld, because it's actually much more of a time travel story now than it is a journey into the underworld. There are some hints of Greek architecture here and there, but for the most part Atlantis is a fully sci-fi setting with future technology all over the place. It's supposed to be a representation of what the city actually looked like when the Isu lived in it, which makes it much more relevant to Assassin's Creed lore than any mythology around Atlantis. It does link narratively to the last two episodes where Cassandra was learning lessons about power, because here in episode 3 is where she gets a chance to use that power. Poseidon names her as Dikastis of Atlantis, basically the town sheriff, sent out to solve disputes and maintain justice in the city, whatever you happen to define justice as. The political situation in Atlantis is quite interesting. As we know from the ancient lore of Assassin's Creed, the Isu made humans as a race of slaves, but they rebelled and fought a war against them. Atlantis was a place where the Isu tried to live in harmony with humans, but that harmony teeters on a knife's edge. There's a lot of tension between the two groups, and Poseidon hopes that Cassandra, as a hybrid of both human and Isu, can act as a bridge between the two groups. However, as you go about your duties in the city, it becomes clearer and clearer how unjust the society is underneath its glimmering surface. The Isu are biologically superior to humans. They're physically bigger and stronger and have a sixth sense, knowledge, or as it would later go on to be known, eagle vision. Poseidon only gives you one rule in your judgments. Humans are not allowed to use Isu technology. It's for their own good, you see. Their bodies are unable to handle the power of it. So on one side we have these bigger, stronger, smarter uber people with utopian technology, and on the other side we have regular humans. Finding balance between these two groups is impossible because the two groups are foundationally unbalanced. Some of the Isu have sympathy for humans, others are just openly racist, saying they're no better than animals. Your job is to balance these scales, but it becomes increasingly clear that balance isn't even a good idea. The humans need to be free of these oppressive overlords. The idea that humans can't use this technology is also a lie. It's dangerous and sometimes goes wrong, but they can. One quest has a lady turn herself into a hybrid like Cassandra, and if she can do it, anyone could do it. This is the part of the DLC that is most clearly a representation of Alethea's memories. All the realizations about her own civilization that she came to that eventually drove her to join the human rebellion, helping to wipe out her own civilization. She's kind of the opposite of Juno in that way, but that leads into one part of the episode that I think goes a little bit too far. After being here a while, Cassandra is getting fed up with all this responsibility, but a little kid comes up to her and asks her to find his parents. This leads you to a shady underground laboratory where we see the experiments that led to the creation of the Minotaur and the Cyclops and the other monsters back in the base game, all being performed by Aita and his wife Juno, who makes a little cameo appearance here in the flesh. The situation was already delicate enough as it is. This secret underground lab of horrific experiments is a step over the line that just wasn't really necessary for me to get what was going on. It kind of makes the whole thing too obvious. The story was always fated to end with the destruction of Atlantis, but I wish that could have been a choice I came to, not, like, The only obvious thing that could be done, because of Juno and her evil schemes making big monsters under the surface. It's still better than Layla's side of the story, which continues to be extremely weird. Each episode of the DLC is punctuated by a scene with Layla. The idea is supposed to be that the staff is corrupting her and making her lose her mind. When Dr. Victoria's nagging about taking breaks from the Animus eventually gets too much, Layla snaps and hits her with the staff, killing her instantly. This would hit a lot harder if Origins hadn't done such a bad job of setting up Layla as someone I'm supposed to care about, or if Dr. Victoria had any redeeming character traits at all. As it is, I almost agree with Layla's impulse to murder her because she is genuinely really annoying. Alethea starts to wonder if maybe Layla was a bad choice to claim the staff after all, but Layla powers through anyway and eventually has a fight with a very different looking Otso Berg before the DLC is over and out, ready to let the next game deal with wherever the hell this is all going. Back in the Animus, once she's out of the simulation, Alethea takes the time to explain what it all meant, kinda like that guy in Origins, and I dislike it for the same reason because I prefer to come to these conclusions myself, but it is what it is. The lesson of Atlantis was about inevitability. There are going to be countless conflicts and tragedies in the years to come that Cassandra will want to try and interfere in, try to fix. But the reality is that some things you just can't fix. Sometimes it all just has to crumble away. The staff gives Cassandra the power to interfere, to change the whole world, but she mustn't. It would inevitably just make everything worse. Because Cassandra isn't a regular human, she is much closer to the Isu than the humans. A world of magic goddesses is a world that's inherently unjust. Cassandra cannot be a part of that. On a meta level, this is sort of funny, because it's basically telling Cassandra to stop being an RPG protagonist, to stop making these big life-altering decisions because it's too dangerous. Let history run its course without you. This was originally the final ending of Assassin's Creed Odyssey, this conversation about the rest of Cassandra's long, long life. And as an ending, it's fine, and it brings some amount of sense to the previous ending where she shows up and immediately dies. She'd accepted that fate a long time before it happened, and frankly, she was pretty tired of it all. After all that she's been through, what she really needs is a holiday.
If she's not here, Barnabas, we may as well give up. If I have not given up on reading your manuscript on the Turk varieties in Thessaly, then you are not giving up on the roof door.
The Fate of Atlantis was an okay ending to Assassin's Creed Odyssey, but to my shock, they patched in a much better one a year later and forgot to tell anyone. When it came time for the DLC to Valhalla, they thought it would be fun to bring in Cassandra for a quick little adventure in that game, which makes sense, she is immortal now, so you may as well use her. And they marketed it as a crossover DLC. At the same time they put that out for free for Valhalla, Odyssey also got an extra free DLC, labelled oh so innocently on the map as Korfu. I never played it until making this video because the marketing on what this DLC is was extremely unclear. I always assumed it was just some crappy 10-minute mission that briefly sets up Cassandra's appearance in Valhalla. I did not know that it was actually a full 2-hour expansion that is the actual final, for real this time, ending of Assassin's Creed Odyssey. A pretty damn good series finale that barely ties into Valhalla at all. For how perfectly it closes the loop of the whole experience, I can't believe that I never played it before, and that according to one of the executive producers, it wasn't even originally planned. They only had the idea to make it thanks to COVID preventing their usual archiving procedures, meaning that all of the development tools to make more stuff for Odyssey were still available. The setup is also simple. After all the immense amounts of stuff she's been through, Cassandra has taken a vacation. It was supposed to be a few days, but instead it's been 6 months of sipping wine on the beach. Barnabas and Herodotus are a bit worried, so they've come to check on her. After all the crazy simulated adventures, it feels right that the very last part of the game should be grounded in the friendship between these 3 adventurers. But as the story progresses, Cassandra's destiny and responsibility just keeps creeping back into the story like some kind of curse. Barnabas and Herodotus have set up a little pretend treasure hunt to lighten Cassandra's spirits. But then it turns out there actually is a treasure hidden on Korfu and some nasty pirates are after it. Then it turns out that this is no ordinary treasure, it's an apple of Eden that drives the pirate captain completely insane. When Cassandra tries to pick up the apple, it does something to the Spear of Leonidas, overcharges it and breaks it. That's when Alethea comes calling to tell Cassandra that it's time to embrace her destiny. Everything that she had been trying to escape just keeps flooding back in. The spear breaking is actually a rare case of a game depowering you. After having the superpowers for the entire game, you're suddenly forced to deal without it all and just be a regular human who's quite good at fighting. And the spear doesn't get fixed. Alethea can't fix it, it's just a broken spear now. The Age of Heroes is over, just like that. Alethea wants Cassandra to travel the world hunting down the pieces of Eden and making sure they don't end up in human hands. Their potential for destruction, just like Cassandra herself, is too great. So in that way, Cassandra is the harbinger of the end of magic in the world. She doesn't want that responsibility at first, but then Barnabas picks the thing up and you have the last boss fight in the whole game against Barnabas as he loses his mind. You don't have to kill him in the end, but it's a lesson to Cassandra about the fragility of all those around her, the danger these things possess, and that even without her superpowers, she can still do something about it. She gives the broken spear to Herodotus as a memento, where he'll keep it hidden until eventually it ends up in the hands of Layla at the start of the game. It completes the loop of the spear, and in doing so, closes the loop of Assassin's Creed Odyssey as a whole. So, finally, for the first time after so many different endings, the credits roll. There are a couple of post-credit scenes. One is good, a little scene of Cassandra visiting the Library of Alexandria, which is accompanied by the main music motif of Assassin's Creed Origins, a nostalgic wee touch. The other one is a trailer for the crossover DLC with Valhalla, a hilariously tone-deaf "Cassandra's story continues in Assassin's Creed Valhalla, in stores now!" But I suppose hilariously tone-deaf sets accurate expectations for Valhalla. Korfu is my favourite kind of ending, especially for something as long and dramatic as Assassin's Creed Odyssey. It's not a big action-packed climax, it's a fond farewell, one last ride with the old crew before everyone moves on to distant shores. A bittersweet ending to be sure, but by the real definition of that word, where there is as much sweetness as bitterness. One expression that really annoys me is, it's a great game, it's just not an Assassin's Creed game, or a Halo game, or whatever franchise we're talking about where this comes up. It bothers me when people get so set on these labels that I feel like you're ignoring the first part of that sentence. It's a great game. People will say, oh, they should have made a separate franchise if this is the kind of game that they wanted to make. Well, they did. It was called Immortals Phoenix Rising, and it's pretty good. They brought back Cassandra to voice Athena and Alexios to voice Ares. Great stuff. But nobody played it, and you want to know why? Because that name is shite, but also because it's not called Assassin's Creed. Maybe by your definition, Odyssey isn't an Assassin's Creed game. I don't really care. I care what the game is to me. For the grand adventure that this game takes me on, the only name that I care that it lives up to is Odyssey. It is a divisive game. So much of what I love about it is what other people hate about it, and if you think that it's boring, tedious, and repetitive, that's perfectly understandable. Just don't write it off just because it's not like what you expected or wanted it to be. You can't please everyone with a game. Some games are just not made for everyone. And if you try and make them for everyone anyway, well, you end up with Assassin's Creed Valhalla. That's future Kyle's problem.
Keeper, see for yourself. You are a protector of men, an intermediary of our world and theirs. Your journey will take you to lands of kings, queens, and conquerors, over water and through fire, into revolution and rebellion. But your presence will mean peace, Keeper. Take up this task, for them and for yourself.
It's done. I cannot believe that's somehow not going to be the longest one in this series, but for what it's worth, thank you very much for watching, and a very special thank you to my wonderful patrons for your continued support. If you'd like to see your name up here, or just support the work that I do, then please consider signing up. It would mean a lot to me. As well as a like, comment, share, subscribe, and ring the bell because that eagle is back and it's circling. To see my entire Assassin's Creed series critique, you can click this playlist up here, or for something a bit different, I recently talked about that Section 31 movie, and spoiler alert, it's terrible, so you can find that video down here.